katoa, no mai, haere mai, piki mai ki tēnei hui. My name is James Shaw. I'm the co-leader of the Green Party, Minister for Climate Change, Statistics, and the Associate Minister of Finance. Thank you very much for joining us this evening to talk about our Future of Transport plan. This is something that's very dear to my heart. My very first election campaign was the 1990 general election campaign, which was the first ever Green Party election campaign, and I was campaigning for light rail from the Wellington railway station through to the airport. And now 30 years later, here I am still campaigning for the same light rail line, but we're now closer than ever to being able to actually put that into reality and to finally start to decongest and to decarbonise not just Wellington's transport network, but right across Aotearoa, New Zealand. Transport, of course, affects everything. It affects the way we live, where we work, how we get from A to B, how we transport freight around our cities. It is fundamental to our ability to create an inclusive and fair society, as well as to create a low carbon future and more environmentally friendly cities. So it is one of the Green Party's mastermind specialist subjects, if you like. And tonight with me, I have one of the leading masterminds on the subject, the Honourable Julian Genter, who, in addition to being the Minister for Women and Associate Minister for Health, is of course Associate Transport Minister and is a leading transport economist and one of the top people in the country on how to create the kind of holistic transport system that we want. Now, transport is one of the 6 top priorities that we are taking into this election campaign, and that is because we do have an opportunity now really to rewire the country and to get that system operating as well as it possibly can, as well as to stimulate the economy in the short term through the COVID-19 crisis, and put all of that stimulus to work, resolving this really long-term stuck challenge that we have had around COVID-19. And so we will be able to create jobs in the near term and to build the kind of city and the kind of country that we really aspire to. As this whakatauki sums it up, manaaki whenua, manaaki tangata, haere whakamua, care for the land, care for the people, go forward. Now, I mentioned, of course, that I had the Honourable Julian Genter with me. She is, of course, in addition to the Minister, the Green Party's transport spokesperson. And so last Tuesday, we launched a very comprehensive plan for transport around Aotearoa, New Zealand. So welcome, Julianne, and why don't you give us the rundown on what it was that we launched last Tuesday?
Tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā koe James. Thank you so much for hosting. Thanks to everyone who's joining. I got really interested in transport at a pretty young age, and I ended up working in it before I got into politics. And the reason for that is because it turns out that how we design our transport systems is fundamental to the shape our towns and cities take. It affects air pollution, water pollution, climate pollution, how much money it costs to access goods and services, education, job opportunities. And it just fundamentally is something that people have to deal with almost every day, unless they're working from home, which I know a lot of people have been doing more of. But even if you're working from home, the street outside your house will affect your experience of your home as well. So in our transport plan, we have, it's quite comprehensive, but there are about 6 main things I was going to sum up really quickly for you here. At the center of it is rebuilding rail in New Zealand and extending it for the 21st century. So we looked at our 3 biggest population centers, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and we said, how do we connect them up to the other bigger cities around them? Using our existing rail network, we could start running services between Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga, between Wellington, Palmerston North, increase with the frequency, and of course, Masterton. and then extend out from there to Napier and Whanganui. And in Christchurch, we could get a service finally going to Rangiora and Rolleston, and then eventually extend down to Timaru and Dunedin through Ashburton, and then up north, even Kaikoura and Picton, with a more frequent passenger service, not the current sort of tourist-oriented one. And so we have this plan for in several stages to start where we are, to build up services, to extend electrification, and then to start running fully electric services at up to 160 kilometers an hour. And that would be really transformational for our regions as well as for our cities. And this isn't pie in the sky. I mean, Queensland runs similar type services, an area that's not that different to New Zealand. We just need to invest in the tracks we have, improve them, buy the trains, run the services, and then we give people a real alternative to having to drive. And that frees up the roads that we do have, means that the roads operate better, but especially it means that people can take a break from driving, have a zero emissions transit service, whether they can drive or not, and be productive on their commute potentially, sit back, read, do some work, relax. And I know that Kiwis will have experienced rail services like this in other countries. This is something we can and should have in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we need to start building it right now in the response to COVID-19. The second component of our transport policy is really investing in that rapid transit network in our major cities. And I'm looking again at Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, but also Hamilton and Tauranga as really fast growing centers. Busways, light rail, improving the rail services that we do have. We just need to properly fund and prioritize that type of infrastructure. We know that in the response to COVID-19, there's a need to invest in infrastructure. We need that infrastructure to be as effective as possible at moving people and goods in a lower emission way. And so if anyone's interested in the detail of this, we've got the plans all detailed on our website for Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch. And we also talk about smaller cities where public transport services can be very affordable and practical as well, if they get the proper priority. The third component is cycle superhighways. So since COVID-19, during the lockdown, I think we saw people returning to the streets and families getting out there on bikes. When there wasn't as much traffic, people do like to get out and about on their own steam, whether it's for recreation or for those short trips, and a huge number of trips in the morning and in the evening at peak time are in that 5 to 10 kilometer range. And if people felt safe enough to let their kids walk and cycle to school, that would massively relieve the congestion on our roads at the school run hour, take pressure off parents. And if people felt safe to commute to work, walking or cycling, that would, of course, offer huge benefits in terms of reducing congestion, but it also is better for their health and happiness. And the key is making sure that there are direct routes that are away from traffic, separated from traffic. So we said $1.5 billion on top of what's already allocated in the National Land Transport Fund over the next few years. We would let councils put together bids, and they'd have to meet certain criteria, but we need to see a major step change in our cycling infrastructure in order to get the benefits of people using bikes and e-bikes for more trips. The next component of our transport policy is making sure public transport's really affordable. So we talked about a Go Anywhere pass that can be used on all public transport services in New Zealand. That's integrated ticketing. Free public transport for 18 and unders, over 65s for people with a community service card, and half price for tertiary students. And of course, we also talk about limiting the fares for just the general fares. So after you take, say, 8 trips in a week, starting on a Monday on public transport, the rest of your trips in that urban area are free for the rest of the week. This has been done overseas. We know, again, you make the public transport fast, frequent, reliable, and affordable. Heaps of people use it, and that frees up the roads for those who need to use the roads, and it massively can reduce our carbon emissions to rely less on single occupant vehicles. Of course, some trips are still going to be by car or truck, and so it's really important that we make sure that the vehicles on our roads are low emissions and zero emissions as quickly as possible. So we had worked up a plan, the Clean Car Discount and Clean Car Standard, which will help make low emissions and zero emissions vehicles much more affordable to households and businesses in New Zealand. And happy to talk about that in more detail later on in the webinar. But also we just need to put an end date on it. And so we said, you know, let's follow the UK. They're set to, it looks like, bring forward the date for selling fossil fuel vehicles to 2030. So no more fossil fuel vehicles sold after 2030. We said, we think it'll be, we'll stop importing fossil fuel vehicles. So we've got the next 10 years. And after that, we're not importing light fossil fuel vehicles. And we also have a plan to help transition the heavy fleet, although we realize that might take longer. So a big part of our overall policy is making it easier for people and goods to move around the country without being in a vehicle, and then making sure the vehicles that are on our roads are powered by clean energy, whether that's battery electric or immediately making biodiesel more available to the heavy diesel fleet, and then switching to hydrogen potentially. So these are options, a comprehensive plan. It's the way we're going to tackle climate change, but there's going to be a whole heap of other benefits that come with
it. Thank you, Julianne. I know that there'll be like a ton of questions coming up on the detail of a number of those things. I just wanted to say, for people who have tuned in since we started the webinar, welcome, Haere mai. Please feel free to send through your comments, your questions, in the comments section, and we will do our best to get to those. We've actually had quite a lot of questions that were posted in advance, and so we'll start with those, but we'll sort of do our best to respond to anything that you put in the comments as we go here. So what's going to happen now is Julianne and I are just going to have a short conversation about some of the detail of what it was that Julianne was just talking about in terms of those 6 key components of our transport policy, and then we'll turn it over to some of those questions. The thing that I was curious about, Julianne, is in my memory of Green Party campaigns, one of the things that's different about this plan is that there's a big focus on regional rail networks, commuter rail networks, and my sense is that historically, the Greens have really focused on the inner city, whether it's walking and cycling or the rapid transit systems. Can you say a bit about what's shifted and why it is that we've got such a big focus on the regional rail this time?
I think in the response to COVID-19, it's become apparent that government is going to take the lead in investing in infrastructure, and there's a recognition that maybe there's a bit of a deficit in infrastructure. And so that's really where we said, well, if we're going to be spending billions of dollars on infrastructure, it needs to be taking us towards a zero carbon future. And we also have the issue of housing unaffordability in some of our main centers. And one of the ways that we can address that is to make it much easier for people to live in smaller areas outside, but still have a viable, kind of comfortable commute. We've got the rail lines, and it makes sense for us to use those corridors. Now this government has been investing in rail. We're working on the City Rail Link. We've committed to funding the third main, which is needed in Auckland, and Kiwi Rail's had quite a bit of additional funding for maintenance and whatnot. But we really need to step it up, and there's an opportunity to step it up in the response to COVID-19 in a way that just addresses a whole lot of other issues, not just job creation in the short term, but productivity benefits, transport and housing affordability, and reducing pollution.
So I know that there are some people who've been a bit skeptical with me when I've talked about this, the idea of getting trains that can travel on New Zealand's quite narrow gauge track at up to 165 kilometres an hour. That seems like not our historical experience. How do you do that?
So what we looked at is we looked at comparable jurisdictions like Queensland and Japan. Of course, Japan does have, bullet train type technology, but they also have older lines that were laid earlier that are narrow gauge. And the reason for that is the same reason New Zealand does. I mean, Japan has similar topography to New Zealand and also has issues with earthquakes and whatnot. So, and that's really where the tilt train technology has been pioneered on some of their old regional lines, and also adopted in Queensland for some of their regional services. So we know it can be done. And when you look at the price tag, it's actually very affordable compared to what some of the other parties are talking about, putting a new 4-lane highway where we already have a highway, and the existing highway could do with some safety improvements. But actually, if you're going to spend that much money, it's a lot cheaper to upgrade our existing rail network and buy some new trains and run those services. But we need that shift in how we look at transport, because New Zealand was very much like the United States for most of the 20th century, where we separated out rail and only looked at cars and trucks. And that's why it's such a great opportunity now. It's like every improvement we make to the rest of the network that's been underinvested in, not only benefits the people who use it, but benefits the roads.
And are these the Go Anywhere card, which is, at the last campaign we ran on this idea of a green transport card, this has evolved again. Can you just talk a little bit about how that works, and again, how it's different from the green transport card that we campaigned on at previous elections?
Well, previous elections, we looked at a card specifically targeting tertiary students. And in this term of government, we did investigations into a fare concession that would help people with community service cards, because they're, they have limited income and they need to be able to get around just like anyone else. But public transport often doesn't serve their needs very well at the moment. So what we found doing that work is that actually there needs to be a real big focus on integrated ticketing, because it's going quite slowly. And until you have integrated ticketing and a shared solution that can be used across New Zealand, it's very hard to implement these kind of fare discounts in different cities. So every city is kind of in charge of their own system and has their own approach to fares. And we want to just raise it up a level and say, how can we all work together and make sure that we're delivering really, really affordable public transport to everyone who needs it in New Zealand? And in some places, the 18 and under discount already exists. And the interesting thing about that is it really helps families. And it means actually you get more adults using public transport on the weekend because they're taking the kids, whereas they would have maybe not made that trip or would have made it in a car. But we want to deliver those sorts of benefits all the time right across the country. Another key feature of the Go Anywhere card, to me, that's really important, is integrating car share services and micromobility and e-bike subscription services. This is something that has happened for decades in places like Germany, where your public transport pass not only gets you on the buses and trains and the light rail, it also, you can go down the street, find a car share car, book it on your phone or book it online, and then swipe in with your public transport pass and just pay for the time you're using the car. And that becomes a real game changer, because it means households can own one fewer car. Maybe that means they don't have their third car, or they don't have their second car, or maybe they go car free completely. People will still need to use a car for some trips in New Zealand, but if you can give people access to a car and a really great high quality EV without having to own one, then you really start to see the benefits of, reduced need in cities for so much on-street parking, but the huge savings to the household of not having to own the car, get the WOOF, get the insurance, and pay for it to be sitting there 96% of the time, when you actually just want to use a car for some trips. And for other subscription services will also be a game changer, because lots of people are getting into e-bikes, but there's many households that can't afford that high upfront cost. And if we can make it easy for people, they can pay for it like a Netflix subscription, then they can really start to cycle. Of course, that's why we need the cycle superhighways. So the two things really go together, that safe, separated infrastructure and easy access. But I guess what we wanted to offer was a whole alternate vision, not just swapping over all the cars for electric cars that are going to be really expensive and sit there in traffic, but how do we really make everything just one tool in your transport toolkit, your green transport toolkit, and really make sure that everyone has access, not just those of us on high incomes.
I just wanted to pick up on that thing about car sharing, which I think is overlooked. I was talking to a woman last year who lives in Wellington, she has 2 kids, lives by herself, has 2 kids, and she, typical Wellington house, doesn't have off-street parking or anything like that, and was using a car share once a week to do the family shopping, with like 6 bags of shopping, but then discovered she didn't really need it for much else, right? And so it was kind of just doing one or 2 trips and finding that really helpful. And I wanted that sort of triggered for me because we've got some questions which I'll put to you. One of them is actually a woman from a similar situation. So I just want to read this out to you and then see what you've got to say about this. She hasn't given a name. She says, "I'm a working mother with a toddler and carer of disabled whānau. I can't see how public transport options work for me. I often make 4 trips a day in my car at least, and I'm extremely time poor as it is. I don't want to use my car as much, but with the current public transport options, mainly catering people working 9 to 5, travelling to the city and back, what are options for greener and efficient transport options for people, especially women like me, who keep our whānau and our communities running?"
That's such a good question. And I can think of several different ways of answering it. I mean, firstly, there's no question that currently the public transport and walking and cycling aren't a viable option for many people. And that's why we have such a high car ownership rate. And so one of the things we're proposing to do is to invest in the alternatives. So public transport is more viable, and it's not just around those morning peak commute trips in and out of the city, but it becomes all day frequency, connecting up networks right across a community or a city. But the other part of it is, it doesn't have to work for everyone. Some trips will still be by car, and that's okay. What we're trying to do is make it easier for the next person to use public transport. And a really good example of this is, say, the Northern Busway. There's still people who will probably are driving across the Harbor Bridge. But since the Northern Busway was put in place, there's about as many people crossing over in the peak by bus as there are by car. And of course, it's just one lane, and it's not even an extra lane on the bridge. And yet it's basically doubled the capacity of the bridge because people are using the bus. So I would say this plan, it may not mean that you take public transport for every trip or any trip, but you're still going to be better off if more people can. And we wouldn't presume to tell people that they shouldn't be driving a car. Our whole goal is to make it easier for people to get around without a car, or to be able to get into a low emissions car. And that's where our discounts around low emissions vehicles and our approach around car share is, for that woman, if right now she needs to use a car 4 times a day, then car share might not work. But as over 10 years, as we substantially invest in improving public transport and making it safe to walk and cycle, then it might be that she has better alternatives, or it might be that she just doesn't get stuck in traffic because other people are able to take up those alternatives.
That segues nicely. You were talking about for people who are going to rely on a car for quite some time to come, and you talked about the fact that we're going to require that vehicles imported after 2030 are zero emissions. So, for people who do want cars, but of course, one of the points of resistance at the moment is people talk about the high upfront cost, particularly of EVs, And so somewhat famously, you did quite a lot of work in this term on a fee-based scheme. Can you just get into the detail a little of how the fee-based scheme works in the proposal that the Greens are taking into this election?
So we called it a clean car discount, and it works in conjunction with a clean car standard. So that's like a fuel efficiency standard, which would increase the supply of lower emissions vehicles provided by dealerships. And then the fee bait, or the discount part, offers pretty substantial reductions in the upfront cost of a low emissions vehicle. And we make that cost neutral by putting a very small fee actually on the more polluting vehicles that are being imported. And most of those are brand new. So the good thing is that 95% of our secondhand vehicle market comes from Japan, and Japan's actually pretty far ahead when it comes to fuel efficiency. So most of the secondhand vehicles that are coming in, if they're not really old, like they will be relatively efficient and much more efficient than the vehicles that were mainly selling brand new here in New Zealand. And so the specifics of the discount could vary. The one we consulted on during this term of government had up to an $8,000 discount on a zero emission vehicle that was brand new, and a slightly smaller discount, I think up to $2,000 on a secondhand pure EV. And we decided to go with a more ambitious one that would offer bigger discounts for just a slightly higher fee on the most polluting vehicles, but would probably take away the discount on the petrol vehicles. And just there'd be this band of vehicles that are relatively efficient, but not zero emissions, not high emissions, that are not affected by this policy at all. And we also want government, and government is working on this, to massively increase the number of electric vehicles that we're buying, because government's a big procurer of vehicles for the various ministries and agencies. And that will increase the supply of secondhand EVs that are available on the market 3 to 5 years from now. Really, the principle of it's very simple. Just make it more affordable to buy an EV up front. Most New Zealanders don't buy brand new vehicles. It's really businesses that do. So it'd mainly be businesses that are affected. And those that are in a position to switch to electric, we need to give them that financial incentive to do so.
Thanks for that. And actually, I have to say, so in my travels as climate change minister, when I talk to some of the larger companies in New Zealand, they actually do want to, the vast majority of them actually do really want to decarbonise quite rapidly. So that kind of makes sense. We've actually just had a comment from Kahurangi Hippolyte, who says, I don't believe it'll be possible to get rid of cars permanently, but it doesn't sound like that's what you're trying to do. You're just trying to make, why don't you say what it is you're trying to do?
Oh, definitely not. Like, cars are part of how people get around. And the key thing is that instead of it being like 8 out of 10 trips in the morning peak, we want to get it down to, say, 5 or 4 out of 10 trips. And we do that through massive investment in rapid transit, but also having that holistic approach, that plans for all types of trips, not just cars and trucks, and not just those peak hour morning trips, but sees public transport as a viable way of getting around.
Now, I'm just going to come back to some of the questions that we received before we started the show. One of them says, what is the cost per tonne of carbon mitigated of your decarbonising transport program? And of course, next year, the Climate Change Commission is going to give the government our marching orders and say, look, here are the carbon budgets that you've got for the next 15 years. And so that equation around directing our expenditure towards the things that make the biggest difference for the lowest cost is going to be quite a big part of that, part of that conversation. So what's your response to that?
The really interesting thing is that when we looked at the clean car standard and the clean car discount, for example, the cost per ton of carbon reduced was actually negative. So you're looking at different policies and you're saying we want the least costly one. And this one was negative in that there were positive benefits from making the fleet more efficient that were mainly perceived by households and businesses spending less money on petrol. So energy efficiency in transport is also not just good for the climate, it's a massive economic gain to the country. And so that's one reason why I'm particularly excited about transport, is because not only is it part of the solution to climate change, but it also just costs less to move people and goods in these ways rather than focusing on cars and trucks for all trips.
There's one of the things that I often talk about is in my role as Associate Finance Minister, talking about the kind of macroeconomic stuff, is that we import $7 billion worth of petroleum into the country every year to power our cars and trucks. And our trade deficit, although obviously with COVID it's a bit up the spout at the moment, but our trade deficit generally is about $5 to $6 billion a year. So we could go from being in trade deficit to being in trade surplus just by not having to import all of that petroleum and instead powering our vehicles from energy that we produce from renewable sources here in Aotearoa. I've got the next question is from Sue Pugmire, who I think you know. And Sue asks, she's talking a bit about needing to level the price playing field, as you were just talking about before, to encourage more EV uptake. So in addition to the clean car discount that you were talking about, what's going to happen with the road user charge or things like taking off GST, or at one point we were talking about fringe benefit tax as a potential way to go. What are we considering some of those this time?
We know that we have to extend the RUC exemption a bit longer for sure. And I know that many current EV owners will be relieved to hear that. I mean, eventually we're going to have to find a way of charging for road use that doesn't rely on petrol tax. And the current road user charge scheme isn't really fit for purpose because it treats vehicles all the same, whether it's a big double cab diesel ute or a very small electric vehicle, they would be subject to the same road user charges, which doesn't seem fair. So we have to do some more work on how we pay for building and maintaining roads in our country before we do that. So I'd say probably RUC exemption for at least a couple more years or till EVs are 2% of the fleet. And then the main policies we focused on are the clean car discount and the clean car standard. We did look into removing fringe benefit tax, but that was decided to be less advantageous or less fair because it only applies to company cars, whereas the clean car discount will apply to all cars, including big rental car fleets and things like that.
Great. And I've just got one last question on this from someone I think called Feeble. It says, I recently bought an EV. Will the clean car discount negatively affect the resale value of used EVs that are already in the country?
I wouldn't think so, because I think they'll still be in high demand. The discount wouldn't apply to your EV once you're selling it within the country. It only applies at the point of import. So the whole point of it is to influence the people who are importing vehicles into New Zealand so that they're able to sell more low emissions and pure EVs. And we're pairing that with the standard. But I wouldn't think it would negatively affect the resale value. If anything, once we get more EVs, I think we're going to have a better service industry to support them and to offer options when batteries need to be replaced or refurbished.
I want to turn now to two-wheeled EVs, and I know you're a big fan. This question is from Mark Johnston, who asks, the upfront cost and storage of e-bikes is still a barrier to ownership for many, and I think you said that in your remarks before. How will you encourage e-bike share and purchase subsidies?
Well, one of the ways we see an opportunity to do that is through our Go Anywhere card and just making micromobility schemes and potentially rent to own or e-bike subscriptions integrated with that. And so the idea would be to just make it a lot easier so people only have to have one app that has their transport pass loaded on it, or they've got the card and that's giving them access. I mean, I imagine that over time, more and more people will be relying on their devices, but we still envisage having both a card and the option for it to be on an app, and then making sure that everything's integrated so that when you need to get from point A to point B, you just have to open up your one app. And interestingly, when I was in Paris, there's a really good transport planning app, and I'm just blanking on the name of it, but you can like look it up and you're doing a journey search like you're in Google Maps, but it's not Google Maps, City Mapper. And you say you want to go from point A to point B, and it gives you all these different options. And the options are Uber or Lyft or what, taxi with the amount it might cost, public transport with the time it will take and the cost, and even integrating bike share into the public transport. So you could cycle to a rapid transit stop that's a little bit further away and jump on that. And it gave you all those options in a matter of seconds, the amount of time, the carbon emissions, the calories you burn, the amount it'll cost you. That's already operating in many cities overseas. So I don't think we're not going to be inventing anything really radically new, just bringing the best of finally to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and giving people those better options.
Okay, so now moving on to trucks. So I've got a question here from Rick Christie. He says, I'm interested in the comparison between oversized diesel trucking coupled with the cost of oil-based road maintenance versus reinstatement of rail freight systems. Specifically the Wairoa to Tairāwhiti line, which it seems was deemed economically feasible in the 1930s, using more manual labour and almost extended to the Bay of Plenty via Gisborne and beyond, and yet the line beyond Wairoa is now impossible despite huge technological advances since the 1930s. Never mind the general intent of the policy, tell me, will Green MPs actively promote reconnection for our people on the East Coast?
Yes, and we do have that reinstatement of the Wairoa Tairāwhiti line in our plan. And I know that there's some work that needs to be done on that to understand exactly the full extent of the work, but we certainly budgeted for it, and we saw it as a place where we could extend passenger services, in the second phase of our regional rail plan. I agree there's, the economics of transport has been stacked against rail and towards cars and trucks in a way that just actually costs us a whole lot more money. And so we just need to keep on implementing that paradigm shift that we've started to introduce through our first government policy statement on land transport. So since we've been in government, we've certainly been working on ensuring that rail is considered as part of the whole transport network, that rail funding has been massively increased. But I think we could really use another term of government with a lot more influence on transport to carry that through to the full kind of paradigm shift and benefits that, right now it's still a bit fragmented. And that's why I guess you see Kiwi Rail not wanting to reinstate this line.
Well, sticking with the question around, actually, I have a question about, which I'll ask you, because I've got another question from Sue Pugmire, which is around the Auckland-Wellington connection being fully electric. And Sue asks, how difficult or possible will it be to make the Auckland to Wellington rail fully electric? I believe that apart from the sections from Waikanae to Palmerston North and Hamilton to Auckland, it's already electrified. But are there gauge or AC/DC issues? Can they be overcome for a clean, efficient passenger and freight rail network we can add to, and how soon can that happen? And I have a supplementary question, which is around some of the new technology, because we're talking about hybrid and hydrogen engined vehicles. And so I had someone ask me this the other day, and I didn't have a good answer for them. is it cheaper to get a hydrogen train running on that section of the track than it is to electrify it? Why would you electrify it if the actual freight, if the vehicle itself is changing its fuel source?
Well, that's a fair question, and I think that answer to that will be changing over time. So it depends on where hydrogen gets to. Right now, Wellington is on a different voltage than the rest of Auckland and the Auckland to Palmerston North line. We did envisage extending electrification to Hamilton as part of our plan, but we also saw that there's a lot of opportunities. You could do two things. One is in Europe, they already have this issue where there's different voltages and you have dual mode trains that can handle the two different voltages. But the other option is, and the dual mode trains that we should probably be looking at are either battery electric or hydrogen trains that can run on electricity and then store the electricity and then continue running on the rest of the line without the overhead wires. And I don't have the analysis right here saying what the best option for New Zealand is, but I do know that if we're in government, we will commission that work and we will find the best solution. And we know they're out there. It's not that hard, but we do need the funding so that we can procure the trains. And there's probably some logic in extending electrification from Auckland to Hamilton. And then the question of what we do about Wellington and between Waikanae and Palmerston North is a little bit open because of the fact that most of the Wellington region is on a different power source.
Great. Now, just while we're talking about the Wellington line, I've got a question from Graham Brown here, who asks, how about avoiding the disruptive forced change of mode at the Wellington railway station by using tram train, say from Porirua, Johnsonville, Melling through to Newtown? So rather than people coming from the north of the city and then having to change at the railway station onto a light rail line, could you simply extend those lines all the way through to Newtown and eventually to the airport, but just run different vehicles on the north-facing part of that network?
Yeah, and I think that that's a fair question. And we had in our long-term plan, we suggested maybe connecting up the Melling line to the Wairarapa line with light rail, and that would involve using tram trains. If we were to do that, I think it's worth investigating. They aren't the most common vehicles to buy, so that that probably needs to be weighed up, and there would have to be some improvements or changes to the existing Johnsonville line and Melling line in order to run tram trains on them. But we're certainly open to investigating it. And I also think that transferring doesn't always have to be a painful experience. If you make the services frequent enough, transfers can work really, really well.
Now to Auckland, this one's from John Hill. Under the current Auckland plan, 2 satellite cities are proposed around Warkworth and Pukekohe. The current harbour bridge is clearly vulnerable, as we learned last Tuesday morning, right before we launched our transport policy. The current harbour bridge is clearly vulnerable, and an efficient public transport setup is required along the north-south spine connecting to the airport. What is the Greens' strategic response to this issue?
Well, we do foresee another harbour crossing that is rail only, and we want to extend rail to the airport, although we're looking at a light rail line going through Mangere, as has been investigated by AT and NZTA, and probably, that line would be operable with the North Shore line. So they'd all be connecting up at ATA station. And so we want to really advance these rapid transit services ASAP. And so we see some opportunities to go ahead and work with bus priority on the Auckland Mangere line all the way to the airport, as well as the Northwestern in the next 3 years, and then to transition to light rail, which we've envisaged as being very high capacity and rapid and optimized to run on the surface. But along the North Shore, that'll be mostly grade separated the whole way, and along the Northwestern as well.
Great. So I've got a curly one. This one is from Laurie Mackner, so it's just come in off the chat. New Zealand signed up to the CRPD at the UN. Bottom line is including disabled people by making community more accessible. Do you realise e-scooters on footpaths and e-bikes, even though they legally should be on the road, make the community less accessible? So if you are a wheelchair user or an other mobility disabled or blind or low vision, the community has become less accessible and is forcing many of us back into our homes or to using cars even for short distances because footpaths are not safe and many of us have been hurt.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we've proposed a cycle superhighway fund. I mean, it's really important that we're providing safe, separated pathways that are can be for those higher speed vehicles, and often to be really good for mobility scooters as well. I was just down in Nelson and saw some of their separated cycleways, which were not only being used by bikes and e-bike users and kids on scooters, but also I saw several people in mobility scooters riding right along there. So ideally, we've got a separate footpath to a bike lane, or we've got a low speed environment where, bikes and other of those higher speed micro-mobility devices really have the right of way. But that's not what we have right now. Right now, it's like there's either the footpath or there's the road, and the road is dominated by really big, heavy vehicles. So we need to accelerate the transition to provide safe separation and to prioritize cycles and micro-mobility devices, or create a safe speed environment for them on the existing road.
Now to parking, which I know is dear to your heart. Joe asks, what are you proposing about parking for vehicles in the future? Provision for parking is obviously an important land use issue. If more of us are going to be working from home and not driving, and with an imperative to use productive land wisely for food production, what measures are you considering for urban planning that address the inequities and the inefficiencies of parking provisions that are currently the norm?
Well, actually, that's not in our policy because we've taken some of the most important steps on that already. So a few months ago, the government announced a national policy statement on urban development. And one of the provisions in that was saying councils can't have minimum parking requirements anymore. And what we're expecting instead, and what the New Zealand Transport Agency has developed, is a comprehensive guide to best practice parking management. And so rather than increasing the supply of parking over and above what it needs to be, the idea is we use our existing parking much more effectively, because right now there's about 3 or 4 empty car parks for everyone that's got a car in it. So there's an opportunity to look at other solutions in the way that new development happens and redevelopment within the existing area, so that it's sharing parking more in a centralized way, so it gets used more of the day and cars can still access the parking when they need it. But we can provide smarter alternatives as well, like home delivery services, car share cars, walking and cycling access, for cargo bikes and things like that. So there's all sorts of alternatives, but as long as we had the minimum parking requirements, forcing a large oversupply of car parking that was fundamentally dominating the way that development was happening. And now we have the opportunity to use that land better and manage things in a way that works well for the people who need to use parking, but also works well to provide the community with real alternatives to car dependence.
Julian, I've just been pulled up on the fact that we talked quite a lot about Auckland and Wellington regional, particularly the rail networks, the commuter rail networks. Can you just dive a wee bit into the Christchurch, what we're proposing for Christchurch, and if I dare, all the way down to Dunedin as well? So talk to me about the South Island.
Yes, so in Christchurch, there is an existing rail line that's not currently being used for passenger services other than a kind of tourist service that Kiwi Rail runs between Picton and Christchurch, and I believe the West Coast as well. And we said, well, we should use that existing rail line to start offering some passenger services to Rolleston and to Rangiora in the short term. And we'd also like to see bus priority accelerated in Christchurch where it's needed to make the bus services more frequent and attractive to people. And we looked at running a bus rapid transit line basically from the airport into the city center and having an interchange with the heavy rail network so that people getting off the passenger rail services could jump on a frequent bus right into the city center. Oh, night. I've just got a naked child here. Maybe not the best time. And we want to run passenger services pretty frequently all the way down from Christchurch, Ashburton, Timaru, and Dunedin. So really connecting up that whole east coast of the South Island with frequent passenger trains that give people a real alternative to driving. And of course, once you get to the new city, you'll still have that same Go Anywhere card, which gets you on all the public transport in the new city or into the car share in the new city or onto an e-bike in the new city. So it's just can be totally seamless. And this is something I believe we could really develop over the next 5 years. Like within 5 years, we could have a totally transformed transport network within New Zealand if the Greens are in government.
And with your sticky fingers all over the transport portfolio and budget to match. Now, so one thing that we haven't talked about, of course, is air transport. And I wonder, this is something that as Climate Change Minister, I've been doing a bit of looking into, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. So heavy vehicles, we use to move goods around and people in the form of buses. And in the very short term, there's something we can do on that, which is, ensuring that there's a biofuel mandate for sustainably produced biofuels. And then over time, we're going to have to switch out the fleet as well. And sorry, were you talking about air transport? Did you say air transport? Okay. And so passenger rail is a big part of the alternative to air transport, but also very exciting to see the development of battery electric planes for very short flights. And I imagine that technology will be developing over the next few decades. It's going to be pretty essential for New Zealand that we have some sustainable alternative to jet fuel. And I see within the islands, passenger rail can get us for those shorter trips. But in between islands and going out to the rest of the world, we will need some sustainable alternative. And you might know as much about that as I do from your climate minister role. We are part of Corsia, which is a sort of international Paris agreement group, which is looking at how we can start pricing emissions from aviation as well as incentivizing the alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, it's been one of the things that I've been actually really pleasantly surprised by, because I'd sort of thought of, zero emission airplanes as kind of in the never, and not arriving until kind of after the time that we need them in terms of how urgently we need to decarbonize. But in Christchurch, there's actually a company importing 2-seater electric trainer airplanes, which are, as you say, sort of suitable just for short trips. I think Sounds Air announced last week that they're going to start importing 19-seater commuter aircraft. So, that is only a few years away. The big one, of course, is jumbos, for those kind of big, heavily used routes. And that is obviously going to take a while, but, with any luck, biofuels will, help us to kind of bridge that gap there. So, look, we're getting towards the end of the show. And I just wanted to ask you about, from a sort of an economic recovery and a connected community perspective, what are the next steps here, and what are you looking forward to?
Well, the most important thing, I think, is that we take this opportunity in the next year while we're responding to the economic fallout from COVID-19 to make sure all of our investments are green and that they're taking us in the direction of a kind of people-oriented transport system that creates healthier, happier cities. We got this brief glimpse of what our cities would be like without traffic during the lockdown. Of course, we still want people and goods to be able to move around, but it was also brilliant to be able to hear the birds and how clear the air was, and to let the kids just have free reign to be independent around their towns and cities. And I guess my main message is we can have that and still have people and goods moving around New Zealand with the Greens at the heart of the next government.
And, from my own perspective, around climate change, our emissions as a country are high per capita, but they've been largely stable in every sector except transport, where our emissions have just been going up and up and up and up and up. And so, from my perspective, like, this has got to be a top priority for the next government, because if we don't get to grips with decarbonising our transport network, we have no hope of being able to stay within that threshold of 1.5 degrees of global warming. So more power to your elbow, Julianne. We're going to wrap this up now. I do want to say to those of you who are watching and listening, first of all, thank you very much for being with us. Please sign on to our Future of Transport petition. You should see a link that's going to be inserted into the Facebook comments as we speak, and the more of you we can get signed up to that, we could really do with your support. I do want to say kia ora mai, Julianne, and to all of you who have been listening and participating. Thank you very much for the questions and the comments. The star of the show was clearly Joaquin, just judging from what we're seeing in the comment section there. So that was a beautiful interlude. And I just want to say thank you very much for participating. Thanks again to Julianne for leading us through that. And just to sign off with another whakatauki, he rau ringa e o oti ai, with many hands the job will be finished. And remember, if you haven't already, party vote green on or before October 17.